Well, we've been doing a series of lessons on senses, like senses that have driven the sermons I've preached. And so we talked about, are you listening? Your hearing. Are you seeing, or what do you see? Your sight. We talked about, how do you smell? The aroma of Christ. We carry around with us the fragrance of the aroma of Christ. So this week it leaves me with one of two senses to talk about, either touch or taste. And I'm saying I'm going to teach on the latter. And as I started to think about taste, I kind of assumed I would go down a direction talking about maybe you're the salt of the earth, and are you salty enough, where he talks about if salt loses its saltiness, it'll be thrown out and trampled underfoot. But I started thinking about our calendar as a church, and this Sunday in our church, we participate in communion. And communion, when you start to think about it, it really is kind of a peculiar ritual. Like, why do we do what we do? I recognize we talk about bread and the cup and what it means, but can you think about like someone who doesn't have familiarity with the church coming in and seeing us eat these little crackers and drink this little cup and just wondering why? Like, why did Jesus choose that meal with his disciples to institute this ordinance that the church still practices today? Do this in remembrance of me. Like, weren't there easier ways or other ways or different ways to remember Christ other than eating and drinking this wafer and this cup? But it's as we start to think about Jesus and when he instituted this, he was seated at the Last Supper, which was a Passover celebration for the Jewish people. He was partaking of a meal when he instituted this remembrance, a meal that was a remembrance of something God had done in the past. I mean, biblically, we see time and time again, God uses feasts and festivals to serve as reminders or the historical dialogue that he has of his people in Israel for generations to come. Why? Psalm chapter 34, verse 8 says, "Taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the one who takes refuge in him." Taste and see. This whole sensory series, it's biblical. The instruction to the psalmist or through the psalmist was for those to taste the goodness of God and see what he's doing. Taste allows us to see better. When the senses work together, we're able to recall more and more. When you think about Israel and its history, they didn't write logs or books, but most of their history was passed on orally. It was tradition-based. And the senses, the sights, the smells, the sounds, the feels, the things we heard, they allowed people to remember better, more effectively remember what God was doing. That's what happened with the Passover feast. I'm going to give just a brief outline of what was going on. Quick summary. Israel, right? They had gone to Egypt to flee the famine that was in the land. When they were in Egypt, they multiplied and grew to the point that Pharaoh was intimidated at their size, number, and power. So he decided to put them in severe bondage and slavery and rule over them harshly so they couldn't overtake him. So in the midst of this season of slavery, according to Exodus chapter 12, verse 40, about 430 years Israel was in Egypt. So in this time frame, God began to call someone to lead his people out. That one he called, remember the burning bush, it was Moses, in which he called and said, "I'm going to use you. I need you to lead my people out of Egypt." The time of slavery was done. God was finished with his people being in bondage. And so he said, it's time to set them free. So Moses, he goes to the Pharaoh, asks Pharaoh to let his people go. And Moses says, absolutely not. So God sends the plagues. Remember, there was water that turned to blood. There were frogs, gnats, and flies. There was the death of livestock. There were boils, hail, and locusts. And there was darkness. And finally, there was one last plague that was going to come. And that plague was the death of the firstborn son in all the homes in Egypt. And so God began to give his people an instruction to avoid this particular plague. And that instruction was to take a lamb, the best lamb, sacrifice it, take the blood of that sacrifice and put it on your doorposts. And one would think at that moment that would be enough, right? I mean, we sacrificed the Passover lamb, we put the blood on the doorpost, but then God asked them to do something else. And I find this interesting. We're looking at being in slavery in Egypt and being set free, the anticipation and enjoyment of knowing that we're going to be free from what was. But God has another instruction. Yes, you sacrifice the lamb and you put the blood on your doorpost, and the angel of death will pass over you. Then it says in Exodus 12, they are to take some of the blood, put it on the sides and tops of the door frames of the house where they eat the lambs. That same night, they are to eat meat roasted over the fire, along with bitter herbs and bread made without yeast. Do not eat the meat raw or boiled in water, but roasted over a fire with the head, legs, and internal organs. Do not leave any of it till morning. If some is left till morning, you must burn it. This is how you're to eat it: with your cloak tucked in your belt, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. Eat it in haste. It's the Lord's Passover. Just as Jesus used a meal to institute the reminder of what he is accomplishing or what he will accomplish, God says to his people that this is going to happen. I'm going to pass over, but in the midst of this, I want you to have a meal. And that meal is going to serve as a reminder for generations to come. Look at what those verses continue. On that same night, I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animals. And I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt. This is the day you are to commemorate for the generations to come. You shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord, a lasting ordinance. For 7 days you are to eat bread made without yeast. On the first day, remove the yeast from your houses. For whoever eats anything with yeast in it from the first day through the seventh must be cut off from Israel. And on the first day, hold a sacred assembly, and another one on the seventh day. Do no work at all on these days except to prepare food for everyone to eat. That is all you may do. See, there was an ordinance, a lasting festival that God established with the Passover, so his people wouldn't forget what had happened. And he said, I want this ordinance to be something that is sensory. I want there to be sights, I want there to be sounds, and I want there to be tastes that remind them of what I've done. So we come to the Passover that Jesus celebrated with his disciples. Matthew 26, on the first day of the festival of the unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, where do you want us to make preparations for you to eat the Passover? He replied, go into the city, a certain man, and tell him, the teacher says, my appointed time is near. I'm going to celebrate the Passover with my disciples at your house. The disciples did as Jesus directed them and prepared the Passover. When evening came, Jesus was reclining at the table with the 12, and while they were eating, he said, truly I tell you, one of you will betray me. They were very sad and began to say to him, one after the other, surely you don't mean me, Lord. Jesus replied, the one who has dipped his hand into the bowl with me will betray me. The Son of Man will go just as is written about him, but woe to that man who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he had not been born. Then Judas, the one who would betray him, said, surely you don't mean me, Rabbi. And Jesus answered, you have said so. While they were eating, Jesus took bread. When he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, said, take this and eat it. This is my body. When he took a cup, and when he'd given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, drink from it, all of you. This is the blood of the covenant, which is poured out for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will not drink from this fruit of the vine from now on until that day when I drink it anew with you in my Father's kingdom. Taste and see. Really quickly, there were three elements that were tasted in that passage. The first one was when Jesus was calling out his betrayer. And he said, the one who dips his hand into the bowl with me would betray me. Knowing the Passover celebration, This bowl was likely a bowl of bitter herbs that were placed on the table to remind the Jewish people of the bitterness of the Egyptians and the slavery in Egypt and the bitterness of sin and the slavery to sin in their lives. How compelling that when Jesus was about to taste, when Judas tasted the bitter herbs, he was being called out for being one who was controlled by flesh and sin. Taste and see. The second, he said, while they were eating, Jesus took bread. When he given thanks, he broke it, gave it to his disciples, saying, take and eat. This is my body. This bread was unleavened bread. Remember, they had to have no yeast because this bread was going to have no connection to Egypt. It was going to be made. It had no time to ferment or to grow, to rise. This was a bread that was eaten by the Jews for 7 days in remembrance of this festival. Likely in the Passover meal, the bread that Jesus used was the afikomen. And this afikomen was the dessert bread of the meal. The bread was a reminder of the deliverance from Egypt. Exodus, there was no time for leaven. The bread was broken in half at the beginning, and half was hidden and half was used. And the half that was hidden was set apart for dessert. It was a celebratory bread that was representative of the Paschal lamb. Yes, the one that was sacrificed, but also the one that was coming. It was a messianic bread. And Jesus took that bread and he broke it and he gave it to his disciples. And he said, take and eat this, all of you. I believe identifying that he is the Messiah, saying, taste and see that I'm the Messiah. And the third one was the cup. Matthew 26, he took a cup, and when he given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, drink from it, all of you. This is the blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. Traditionally, there's 4 cups at the Passover meal. They can be found from the verses in Exodus 6:6-7. Therefore, I say to the Israelites, I am the Lord. I will bring you out. That's what the first cup represents, from under the yoke of the Egyptians. The second one, I will free you from being slaves to them. The third one, I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and mighty acts of judgment. And the fourth one, I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God who brought you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. Most scholars believe that Jesus was using or participating with the third cup, the cup that says, I will redeem you, a cup of redemption. Saying to his disciples, taste and see, I am redemption. What are you tasting? I encourage you to read the story of the Last Supper, participate in a meal, communion service, and think about what those elements represent, whether it's bitter herbs representing the brokenness, the embittering, the bitterness of this world, of the bondage of this world, whether it's the bread, the leavened bread, the unleavened bread that is free from the yeast of the world, that was broken and set apart to be the Messiah that has come for you, or the cup of redemption and the cup of promise that you have in Jesus Christ. The Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face shine upon you, be gracious to you, may turn his face toward you and grant you his peace. And may you taste and see that the Lord is good. Be blessed.